Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
So I also want to welcome you. Thank you so much for coming here today. I don't want this to be just an academic discussion. I want this to be so much more than that. What we're planning on is just having a conversation between the three of us for about 45 minutes or so, and then we will open it up for Q&A. And so please be thinking about your questions, and we'll definitely be encouraging them a little later on tonight. So just to get us started, maybe we can make this a little more personal. Professor Wall, if you could maybe talk about where you were born, where your path to where you are now, both academically and also maybe at a faith.
Good evening, everyone. It's really good to be here at Wake Forest. This is just my second time to Wake Forest, and I'm really thrilled to be here. I was born in Jamaica, in the Caribbean. That's home for me. I left Jamaica right after high school and went to Howard University, which is where I did all my degrees, my bachelor's, master's, and my doctorate. And then I taught at Howard for 10 years before going to Duke. My work has focused on genetics and genomics as well. I grew up in a Christian home. My dad was a pastor of a church, and I grew up in the church. My four siblings and I. It's all I've known. And my parents taught us to love the Lord, and at the age of 12, I gave my heart to Him. And it's, I could go on and on about just the way He has led me, all the way to Duke, and then to Wake Forest to be with you. But my faith has been an integral part of my work. My work in genomics points me more and more to God and His goodness and His awesomeness in creating us. And for me, they're integrally intertwined. And the discussion today about race, again, it's all part of how I bring everything together in my life in terms of my scholarship and my own personal life and my upbringing and what I hope to do in terms of my career. My career is my ministry, and it's just good to be here.
Yeah, so I was actually born in Lake Charles, Louisiana. I only lived there 3 years. And then my family and I moved to Kansas City, Missouri. And I grew up there, went to high school there. And then I went to St. Louis University for undergrad. I went to Iowa. And let me just back up in terms of why I studied politics and representation. And Darius actually has a point that I wasn't the only black person in Iowa, right? There were 3 others with me. No. Only about 3% of Iowa was African American. So there were very few. But this question about presence and representation is always fascinating me. I did debate, for instance, in high school, and I see Wake Forest has, and I said the debate team here. And I was like one of the few black people doing the debate. And it was just really interesting. And I wondered, sort of what difference did my presence make in terms of how people understood African Americans and thought about African Americans. And so that really carried on in grad school. And I was really interested in particular, like, what does it mean when African Americans are in government in terms of how blacks think about engaging in politics, and also how people who aren't black engage in politics. And then taking a step back, how do you get people of color, how do you diversify representative bodies, thinking back in terms of big questions about representative democracies and mirror representation, and what makes for the best type of polity, right? So anyway, without getting into all that, I've always been interested in terms of presence and representation and being underrepresented in education. In terms of my faith, I wouldn't say mine is the exact opposite of Charmaine, but it is pretty far different. My family go to church every once in a while. My name is Christopher Jude Clark. I'm named after my pops, so I'm the second, but that's always confusing, because I don't want to be called Junior. But my grandmother was a devout Catholic who named him Christopher Jude because two Catholic saints, that's my point of saying that. And so we would go to church every week, and it was never anything regular. And it wasn't actually until my parents were divorced in 96, 97, when I was about 13 years old, that I think my mom rediscovered her faith, and then we started going to church. And it's really when I think my faith life became centered to my being and just sort of how I operated. What was really interesting was prior to that, I had in-laws that went to church quite a bit. I remember visiting my aunt and her family in 92. In fact, I remember December 27, 1992, visiting their church and some youth ministry, sort of kids' church, right? And they asked people if they would say that they knew Jesus, and I said, no, I didn't. So I went to the front, did a prayer. It really wasn't sure what I was doing, but I remember that night having a dream that I was on a bike, like flying. And it's not like E.T., that's like way free. It was just an amazing dream. It was just joy and freedom, and I've never had a dream like that again. And even though like we didn't go to church, and even though I didn't know much about faith and Jesus and Christianity, in fact, I would pray to both Jesus and God at the same time because I thought they were different people. I just didn't know anything. And church had Christian faith, you can just pray to one of them, it's all good. And so I was really naive, and yet there was a real difference in my life from that point on. So I'll be quiet now, Chris, because you're going to hear enough from me already. But it was very interesting sort of faith trajectory for me. One other thing I'll say, in undergrad, I was really involved in student groups. I really wasn't so much going to church as much. I'd go to like gospel choir events, and those were always great. But it wasn't until I went to graduate school and I got involved in the varsity graduate Christian fellowship. That once again, I kind of think, oh yeah, we got some people in the house. Go, give yourself a hand clap. All right, nothing wrong with that. And then from that point on, so from about 2005 on, my faith has really been central to how I operate and how I view the world. And I don't want to jump ahead in terms of thinking more about what we're going to talk about this forum. So I'll stop there.
Well, what do we call it? Does it interact with your work now?
Yeah, it's interesting. It does influence, what I do. It's hard to say, because I think for Charmaine, it's this really neat connection. And for me, I think like I want to do the best work I can, like as a Christian academic. And I want to be faithful in my work. I want to treat my students well and things like that. So I think it affects that. It's hard to say with representation of African Americans. It's hard to say there's a direct sort of relationship there. But I think it does affect sort of how I go about doing my work. So yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, thanks.
So what we thought, we're not going to set this up as a debate. It's not going to be oppositional in any way. What we thought we would just talk about some issues together. We already gave him a little bit ahead of time. So we're going to talk about issues of race. We're going to talk about current events, and we're going to talk about issues of Christianity, faith, and race. So just to start us off, I want to ask Mr. Well a little bit about the concept of race and maybe how it intersects with your own work. Whether you think it's a health category, whether you think it's a category that we should place or
So when we think about race in genetics, in biology, it's quite different from how people think about race in society. We talk about race in the census in the US has the category race, and we all, or most of us, identify some category that we call race. But genetics and biology and fossil evidence from way back tells us that we don't have race in terms of biology in the human population, in human populations, in the human species. Genetics tells us that we're one species. So the concept of race, if you ask an evolutionary biologist, they'll probably tell you that race is subspecies. So race is a level of divergence below the level of the species. So you have a species, and then you have other subspecies below that level. So some divergence in terms of evolution. And evolution in that sense just means departure and change over time. And so we don't see that when we look at human populations. Even these populations that we call races, when we look at our DNA, we see that it's more alike than different when we look from one person to the next. If you look at my DNA and you look at Christian's DNA, genetics tells us that we're 99.9% the same at the DNA level. So there's nothing biological about the concept of race in humans. So we don't have these marked distinctions. We look differently, and that there are all kinds of reasons for that in terms of over time and the environments that we've been in and that our ancestors have been in. And the environments result in change in our features that help us adapt and survive in different environments. But that does not mean that we are so distinct at the level of the genetics that we can say we have biological races. So when we say race, it's a concept that for me and for many in science and biology does not apply to human populations. For some species, there is that level of differentiation that biologists can say, yes, there are subspecies, there are races in these organisms, such as gray wolves and some species of deer. You could say, yeah, they do have subspecies, they do have races, they are different biologically. So the similarity that we see when we look at humans in terms of biology just nullifies this whole concept of race and difference that we tend to attribute to this concept of race.
Mike, the other ways which is still helpful to talk about race, biological ways.
Yeah, and I think the challenge is when we talk about race in a social sense, and people say race, so people talk about social race. And so when we talk about race, for example, the way it's categorized and it's constructed in the US, the census itself, the OMB categories, when you look at the definitions, it says these are socio-political categories. But biologists and scientists use these same categories in their studies. And so it becomes conflicting for many people when we see studies that show differences and just how some of these studies are reported when we report differences between blacks and whites and Hispanics. What do those differences even mean? And so scientists have a responsibility to communicate what they're finding in terms of what we know about science. And it becomes conflicting when we say there are these biological differences. Because for some people it means, yeah, there really are these races. But in terms of how it's constructed socially, and Chris can talk certainly much more about that, the construction of race, let's just talk about America, because there are other countries like Brazil and South Africa that they have their own constructions of race. But the construction of race in America clearly has some implications for what we see biologically. We can see that the construction of race and the divisions that have been created have resulted not just in biological differences, but in social differences and in educational differences. And these differences translate to some of the biological implications that we see. So it may not originate in terms of biology, but the social construction and what happens to the groups that have been ranked to be lower than some groups. We can see the biological implications in terms of health outcomes. And so it affects us, even if it's socially constructed, the way society deals with those groups that have been raced or racialized has biological implications.
I'll ask the same question over to Chris Clark. Pros and cons of language race.
Yeah, that's a good question. So given what I study in terms of representation and some of the spiel I gave earlier about democracy and all that, I think what's really important about race, maybe Charmaine and I have a slightly different opinion on this, but I look at the U.S. Census and yeah, I know there's some downsides to counting, right? And I get all that you're saying about the biological and the social construction of race, but it turns out that in politics, numbers matter, right? And I don't want to say demographics, or destiny. That would be going a little bit too far, but it's actually not too far from that. So one of the things that we know is that one of the best predictors of electing someone who's African American, okay, is the percentage of African Americans that live in that person's district, for example. So if you want to look at, okay, do I want to elect a black person to the U.S. House of Representatives, having a larger number of African Americans actually, at least you being more likely to elect a black person, okay? And, there's this term called racially polarized voting. I don't know how many of you have taken poly classes. I'm not going to bore you with too many details, but the long and short of it is that people tend to vote along racial lines. And in particular, and in many ways that was attributed to why, despite the South having a large number of African Americans, and in some cases majority African American counties, why was it that there were very few, if no, African Americans actually elected to government, right? So I think for me, I don't take a long time to answer your question, Chris, but it seems to me like one of the pros of recognizing race and counting races is because numbers really do matter, right? And resources are given based upon populations and the whole nine. And so I think it's really important from that standpoint. I also think, maybe more in line with what Charmaine was saying at the end, given that race does matter, right? It's kind of hard to not talk about it because I think sometimes people say, oh, well, I'm colorblind, right? We're in a post-racial society. Some of you may believe that. And I'm more than happy to talk with you, about that. I'm not trying to look down on you in any way, right? But given some of the evidence that I've looked at, and given Ferguson and given other things, I would argue that in fact race is quite significant. And so we ought to pay attention to it, we ought to talk about it. Because if we don't talk about it, then all of a sudden it seems as if it's not there and it's no longer important. One of the cons, and this is hard for me to say, I study race, and it's easy for me to think about the pros. So I'll offer one con is, by talking so much about race, I think in some ways, it then makes it hard to move beyond race, right? So I don't know if it's quite a catch-22. You got to keep me current on my sort of metaphors, right? But that's why I kind of think of it as a catch-22, right? Because if you don't talk about it, then some of the problems that result because of race continue, right, to persist, and you don't recognize them and try to address them. But then, if you want to move beyond race and somehow try to be post-racial, it's hard to do so, given that race is still so salient. So I think that is one of the cons, right? That the more you talk about it, the more you make it central, the more it will be, right? It just continues to be like that in the future. I'll say one other thing, and I know that there are things we want to talk about, and I think the U.S. Census is a great example of another kind of race, is that I think we realize that categories, I don't want to say they're fluid, that's not quite what I mean, but we realize that multiracial people exist, right? So I think you all are smart people here, right? And just wait for us, right? So it turns out that President Obama is in fact, right, multiracial, right? His mother is a white woman from Kansas, and yet we only talk about him as the black president, right? And so I think it wasn't until 2000, you can help me out with this, Charmaine, that the U.S. Census actually recognized that people can mark more than one racial category. So that's another kind of race, is that you have people who are mixed race heritage, blended race. I think there are all sorts of terms that are employed, right, to describe that people group. And yet, in many ways, they're forced to choose, right? Are you black or are you white? You somehow can't be mixed heritage. And so that's another problem of using the language of race. Is people in those categories are forced to maybe choose sides. I think that's a real problem, because if you are indeed both, why can't you embrace both identities? Why aren't you allowed to do so? Oh yeah.
I was going to say, that's historical. That's a one-drop rule.
Yeah.
I don't think we can get away from it so easily.
We're going to transition to talk about something in the slide up there. So Ferguson. And I'm going to actually hand back to Professor Clark. So we're all familiar with what's happened recently. Do you have some unique insight into your time spent in St. Louis area? So maybe you could reflect specifically on what's happened at Ferguson, drawing on your personal experience, and then maybe reflect also about how representative is that of what's going on in the rest of it.
Yeah, that's a great question, Christian. Let me talk to the microphone, sorry. So I told you I grew up in Kansas City, and I went to school in St. Louis. So I'm going to tell a bad joke here. And so I hope that me telling you is bad that you actually laugh. So I don't know how many of you are from Missouri and know much about Missouri, right? But it turns out that people who say Missouri, like myself, tend to be from Kansas City or St. Louis, maybe Columbia, maybe Springfield. But then other people from the great state of Missouri refer to it as Missouri, right? So okay. But, so there's a big difference, and I actually have a reason for telling you all that, right? So Missouri is a really interesting place because you have these two urban cores, and they're connected by I-70. And a lot of African Americans live in Kansas City and St. Louis. In fact, most of the blacks in Missouri live in those two places. And the rest of Missouri is much more rural, much more white, much more conservative. So anyway, this is a bit of information about the geography of Missouri. So with St. Louis in particular, what's really interesting about St. Louis, and in many ways it's representative of other major cities across the country, is there's still actually a high level of segregation there, okay? So I remember being an undergrad at St. Louis University, and I learned pretty quickly that if you're in St. Louis, right, if you go south, South City has a lot of sort of ethnic, people like Bosnians, Serbians, what have you. Also, if you're ever there, really, really good ethnic food, like Vietnamese food. I can tell you some great restaurants if you're all ever there. I mean, good food, right? And you keep going south, you're in South County, and South County is where poor white people live, okay? Sometimes people use really negative terms to refer to that people. I'm not going to do that, because who am I to pass judgment, but that's the general makeup there, okay? Lower income and more white. Let's go north, okay? So if you go to North St. Louis, so North City is heavily black, and then North County is where middle-class African-American people live. That's where my uncle lived when he was there. He's doing well now. He works somewhere else. But anyway, I'm digressing. If you move west, that's where the money really is, all right? You're talking Creve Coeur, St. Charles. Folks they have more money than they know what to do with in West St. Louis, okay? And that's where the nice mall is if you want to go shopping and spend some of your parents' money or your own hard-earned money from St. Louis, that's where you go. If you go east, you cross the Missouri River, or Mississippi, sorry, Mississippi River, and you're in Illinois, a place called East St. Louis. It's not quite Missouri anymore, and very, very different altogether. But if you go past East St. Louis, then you're like in Belleville, Illinois, and that's like a suburb. So anyway, you know in St. Louis, sort of what I just described to you. If you meet anyone from St. Louis, you get that same sort of description, okay? And it's very clear sort of where people live, and I don't know how much of it is due to redlining, sort of like, hey, you're black, therefore you can't live past a certain street. I don't know the history of that. I wouldn't be surprised, since that's what's happening in a lot of places. It was true in KC. So I think that presents a real problem, right? When you segregate people like that. St. Louis schools also lost their accreditation at some point, just like Kansas City did. Thankfully, I was out of the school system by that point. So really poor education in general. And so I think the real problem in St. Louis, in particular for a lot of African Americans there, is really poor educational outcomes, really not a lot of great job opportunities. I think St. Louis really peaked like in the 1940s or so, and then after that point, like the city just hasn't grown very much, and it's remained stagnant. And so you have people, not a lot of job opportunities, poor educational outcomes, high crime rate. I don't know if you all know that St. Louis, outside of war zones, all right, is the second most dangerous city in the U.S. Behind like Juarez, Mexico. Okay, the borders El Paso, where there's a lot of drug killing going on. Right, St. Louis is number 2. Just let that sink in your head, right? It's a very dangerous place to live, okay? And so on top of that, right? So poor job opportunities, crime rates, people, really poor educational outcomes. And I think it's especially so for African American people there. I'm taking a long time to answer your question. So I think the thing with St. Louis, and the way I think about it in terms of my own experience and my own expertise of race and representation, is that people just don't feel very politically efficacious. And I kind of sounds silly saying that, it's sort of an understatement, but they don't feel like government represents them. I don't think they feel like anything will come out of government. It turns out that in the city council there in Ferguson, there was one African American guy, I think out of 7 or so. You all can double check me. Very few African Americans on the police force, right? So it turns out, people, that when there are a greater number of African Americans on the police force, people actually have better relationships with the police. Like, and you might think, oh, that's right, that's kind of crazy, right? But it turns out that actually there's some evidence there that there are better outcomes. So presence actually does make a difference in terms of outcomes, okay, and how people relate to that particular entity of government, right? So I think one of the problems there, and I can't attribute Ferguson all to this, but in terms of how I think about things is, you have a lot of people with really poor poor socioeconomic status, so to speak, or high crime rate, feeling very poorly represented in government. And then, so it's not surprising to see people going to the streets, right? And taking part in what we political scientists like to call unconventional political acts, is we have a term for everything, right? But burning buildings and grabbing guns and looting and the whole nine, right? This unconventional act in politics. So again, I'm not trying to somehow reduce what happened there, but I'm not surprised, just given what I know about that area and what we in political science sort of know about social movements and the like, that what happened. Now, you had a second question.
Yeah, how pervasive could it be?
Yeah. Okay, I think St. Louis, even though, as I said, I'm painting a picture here of being especially dangerous and losing accreditation and all that, and obviously that's not generalized to the whole population, the whole U.S. But I don't think it's too different from other places. I mean, any other sort of urban, core, any place where you have that sort of segregation, it turns out that a lot of cities are in fact segregated. Any place where minorities, African Americans in particular, feel underrepresented and feel like they don't have really any great job prospects, I think you can see that sort of thing happen. Right? I mean, LA riots in 91, 92 were riding the cake. I know it's like way before some of y'all's time, right? But I'm sure you've heard about it. Similar situation, right? And there's certain things that predict social movements and acts of violence like that. And to the extent that those things are true, then I'm not too surprised to see these things happen.
I have a question for you. Okay. So still related to Ferguson, one thing that's got a lot of attention is post-Ferguson, and that really fascinates me, its implications for character a bit, is the idea of implicit bias versus explicit bias. So we all are familiar with explicit bias, because we know people who are biased in all kinds of problematic ways, but I think more than ever, our attention has been called to the idea that we have implicit biases that impact our actions without even recognizing it. And that's true for whites, it's true for blacks. The research shows that these biases are just widespread and pervasive, and can have a significant impact on action. So the question then is, there's no one question, there are lots of really interesting questions. One question is this something that we're just kind of stuck with genetically very early on, this implicit bias? Secondly, we try to overcome our biases in that very complex. Big questions, sorry. All these are big questions.
Well, when we think about, and I'll just talk about it in terms of genetics and behavior, whether it's implicit bias or alcoholism or any behavior that people link to genetics, we often, very often people just say people are hardwired to do this and to do that. But we know that genes always operate in the context of an environment, right? And so even if you're predisposed to some things, there are things around you, there are things that you're exposed to, there are environments that you can connect with, or support systems that you can connect with, that can change the path. And that happens for disease as well as behavior. For many diseases, you could have a genetic predisposition, but you change your lifestyle, you change your behavior, and you may not have that disease. I mean, for some genetic diseases, yes, you have the genetic mutation, genetic variant, genetic changes, and you will have the disease. But for many, genes do not determine the outcome. And I would say the same for implicit bias. I wouldn't attribute it to genetics. What I would say, though, is that as humans, we're all prone to sin, as the Bible says. And that's part of it in terms of not seeing others as we see ourselves and thinking of others as less than. God created us all equal, and genetically, we're just about the same. And so it's for us to treat each other that way. And there are many people who may not be Christians, or who are not Christians, who do treat people well. So I certainly wouldn't say that, as Christians, yes, the Christians will treat people better, others better than themselves. But I will say that if one is not a believer, and there is not that moral compass in terms of the conviction that Christ gives in your life, then there is that greater tendency to be and to do whatever. And I think even though people may say we're hardwired, Christ comes to change and to change us. And as I said, there are people out there who are not racist, who may not be believers, but that does not mean that they don't need Christ and they don't need a Savior, because He does so much more than just that just brings salvation. It changes how we view life and how we view the world.
I'll follow up just a little bit. So, what about people who say that Christians are, some Christians at least, like bad about back to days of slavery, this kind of thing? That's some of the worst things of bias happening in the Christian church. People who call themselves Christians.
That is true, and I'm glad you asked that, because I did talk about God changing your life, and I didn't talk about the fact that there are people who call themselves Christians and don't do the things that we would expect, or that God calls Christians to do. I would say we can't use those people or those events as excuses not to believe. And that even those of us who are Christians, we're not perfect. So we will fall and we will do wrong things. But we know God is always there to forgive. And so anyone is prone to sin, even those of us who are believers. None of us is perfect yet.
Okay. So, two-part question, very simple. So first, what can we be doing better? I asked you specifically about Ferguson, so maybe you put time back to Ferguson. issues that were raised by Ferguson in terms of change for the future, what we can do better, or if you'd like to touch on this issue of bias, and how we can overcome biases.
So this one probably, Chris. So you say that's all what all people could be doing in a group situation?
So we can think about what can Christians be doing better?
Yeah.
What can parents be doing better? What can human beings be doing better? Or what's the students here in this audience right now can be doing better? So why don't we start with people here, us, all of us here in this room, to address our biases and to prevent things like Ferguson like that. So the cosmos of Ferguson.
Wow, Chris, you like that? That's a good question. I'm sitting
That
here
happens
thinking,
when you have philosopher do this.
man, just drop the rock, man. All right. Wow. So, okay, so I think what can we do here? So I think one of the things that's really important, right, is to be honest with ourselves. It's hard to be honest, right? It's hard to admit when you have biases and when you think that you're better than someone for various reasons, whether it's because of your faith, what you believe, or your gender, or your race, or your socioeconomic status, right? But it turns out we all do that. So I think the first step, right, is to be honest. Honest with ourselves about our own shortcomings, right? So let me just talk a bit here. And as I talk, it's going to help me hopefully think more about how to answer this question. But so I'll talk a bit about my own background. It may help me as I think through this. So as I said, I grew up in Kansas City, and I grew up in pretty much all black environment. Okay, like 98% black was my elementary school. Everything to me was about black. You know, my pops, listen to James Brown, I'm a soul brother. And everything's about this, man, brother, sister, that, black this, black that. And, that's how I saw the world. Everything was understood through a black-white perspective. But then as I got older, and especially once I came to faith and understood that, hey, Charmaine said God made us all equal, and it's not as if God doesn't value different cultures, right, and expressions of culture. But it turns out that he really did make us equal, and it really is our identity in him that matters most. So I'm going to go back to that, but just bear with me, folks, as I walk you through some stuff here. So doing debate kind of introduced me to sort of white people writ large, because I didn't know a lot of white people, and I really could, talking with folks, and you have a lot of free time at debate tournaments, and so I got to know people well. We played Egyptian rap groups. I don't think it's necessarily a very nice term, right? I don't know if y'all ever played that card game, or slapjack, right? So we played card games. I got to know people, riding on buses and talking about life and all that. I went to college. St. Louis University is a Jesuit Catholic school. I had biases, all rich white people who are Catholic or hypocrites, right? They go to church on Sunday, but are out drinking on Saturday. And I was an RA. I cleaned up certain things on Saturday and Friday night, so I knew the people were out imbibing, right? So bear with me. But I realized that was wrong, right? Who am I to think I'm better than these people? In fact, people who really inspired me and helped me grow in my faith, were some of these rich white Catholics, right? But again, there was a bias, a barrier that was broken down in my heart that I know that God, Jesus was central in helping me move past that, because I couldn't do it alone. Going to Iowa, right? Very few black people there. In my sense, all sort of white Protestant evangelicals were like really, really conservative. I won't mention names here because I don't want to distract you in my talk here, right? But I just knew they all were on the right way politically, because that's just the way they are. Well, it turns out that they all aren't. And some of my best friends and mentors and people I love, one of them was godfather of my oldest daughter, and two of my pastors, in fact, who I'm like a fifth son, and they're both white people, okay? We're not on that end of the spectrum, okay? Amazing people who taught me a lot. And again, there's another barrier broken down, right? That God made me realize, hey, Chris, you can't go around thinking that all white evangelical people are right wing, right? That's wrong. You can't dislike these people because of that. Now here's the biggest one, and I might have to be careful. Is that back door there? Okay, it's an exit. So moving to the South. All right, I'm from the Midwest. I have a PhD. I've read lots about history and politics. A lot of stuff is going down here. And I'm still working through this, but I made some progress. People like my good friend Hank and others have helped me. But man, I had some real bias against white Southern people, especially white Southern men, okay? For a lot of reasons. And I had to come to grips with that. Like all of a sudden I'm here, I'm like, God, why am I here in North Carolina? Like I'm all, New York City's great, this is a great place, all right? People, I like it here, so keep that in mind. But coming here, I'm like, I'm coming to where it all went down, man. Silent Sam, right? People building slaves, building a university, right? Like Woolworths, man, in the 1960s. This is where it went down. Like Missouri has its own problems, trust me. But like, I don't think it was on the other side. I don't think it's seceded from the union. You help me out, right? So it's been really hard. But right, I had to come to grips with that. I had to say, okay, For instance, there's another bias in your heart, right? And they're white Southern people. They aren't all bad. You know, many of them are quite good. And you can't go around thinking you're better than these people because that's wrong, and that's not what I said is true. And it's still a process, right? I'll talk to you in 5 or 10 years. It'll probably still be a struggle, but that's been the biggest barrier. But I know that my faith, I know that my faith in God, and God working through me, working through other people, is the only explanation, people, because trust me, it wouldn't have happened on my own, because it was too deeply rooted, right? And there's too much evidence of the crap that went down. I don't know if I can use crap. Sorry, Andrew, but the stuff that went down, all right, there's too much evidence of that for me just to intellectually get past that, right? So maybe I haven't answered your question. So I think we got to be honest with ourselves. We got to be willing to face our biases and say, you know what? We're better than this. We were made to be better than this. And this is my Christian faith. This is how I understand the world as a Christian. And we got to aspire to something more. So I don't know how to answer what to do here. Maybe help me out here. Give me another question.
To follow up the statement I had earlier, how do you work through the idea that some of the crap that went down was done by self-proclaimed Christians?
Oh, man. Okay, so I just read A Narrative of a Slave by Frederick. I don't know if y'all are required to read that. Man, that's a good book. Goodness gracious, I wish I read it sooner. Really brilliantly written. But the point I want to make here is somewhere at the very end of the book, right? I think Frederick Douglass does this, but he talks about Christians throughout the book. And one of the things that he does, and if you don't read this last part, you don't really, you kind of think of Christians in a really negative light, right? There's some people who were, and in fact what he said was that some of the Christians were like the worst slaveholders. And in fact, those who didn't claim to be Christians were actually better slaveholders, because they weren't fooled by the fact that they thought they were somehow better people. But one of the things he said at the end I thought was really great, I really appreciated it, was that he said, look, I'm talking about people who really actually aren't Christians, who may be nominal or only in name Christians. Those who really are, don't behave in this way, right? You can't really view them in the same way. And so, again, I think along the lines of what Charmaine was saying, I'm not going around, I don't have like some sort of radar or something that allows me to test like your real Christianity next, right? Now, who am I to walk around and say, well, you're a real Christian, you're not. But I have a hard time believing that someone who's really encountered Jesus and really read the Gospels and really has been transformed can behave in like these really, really nasty ways, right? And it can be involved in some of this stuff, right? We do, yeah, we all make mistakes, we all do sin, but I like to think that since they're convicted by the Holy Spirit, right, and because of their faith life, that they somehow are different and have been transformed. So I would question the extent to which they really are what they say they are. Did I answer any of your questions? You asked a big question. So wait, what are people supposed to do here, or can I get back to that later? It took all 45 minutes. I mean, you give me the microphone, I don't know.
I'll ask both follow-up questions.
Okay, you want to get Charmaine a chance?
We'll let the end be what we do going forward.
Okay, give me some more time to think.
So why don't we pass the microphone over, and and so this is not something we've talked much about before, but since it seemed natural to ask, so why does Christianity support law? What is it about Christianity that should lead us to think that all human beings are equal and should be treated with respect? Why is that the right way to?
I mean, apart from saying that God tells us to love our neighbor.
Who's our neighbor?
Our neighbor is everybody. Everybody we come in contact with, not just people who live next door. Our fellow human, in my mind, is our neighbor. And loving your neighbor doesn't just mean saying, I love that person, but we have to act that way, which means supporting people when they need to be supported, being the helping hand, but also communicating your faith. For me, God has shown up in so many ways in my life. And for me to communicate my faith is telling people what God has done in my life, so they can see that He is real. I mean, He is very real. And for me, that's part of loving my neighbor, because I want what I have. I want them to have what I have in terms of the relationship, in terms of the benefits, if I may use that word, is I'm trying to find a bigger word, of being a believer and realizing that you don't have to do things on your own. You don't have to try to overcome that implicit bias on your own, because there's somebody bigger than you that can help you to do it. So God at work in my life is how I try to love my neighbor. because I try to show them what God has done and to help them, you know, to see Him and to believe too.
Let me get a question again, Chris. Because I was trying to listen to Charmaine and think at the same time. It's hard to do both.
So what is it about Christianity that does support treating people, every person, and treating people without problems?
Yeah, okay, so I'm on board with everything Charmaine said. So I think with me, and I'm not going to pretend like I've, you know, I'm not going to try to quote the Bible. Sometimes I would misquote if I did. But you know, I read, you know, in the Gospels in particular, and sometimes I'm really struck with some things that, you know, that went down. And sometimes it takes a pastor that really knows the context to explain to me the real significance of it. But you know, I look at and read about Jesus and how he interacted with people, and sometimes I'm really confused. I'm like, man, this doesn't make any sense. Like, how in the world did you do that? And again, I don't know a lot about Jewish culture. I'm not like a scholar that can tell you exactly what all these things mean. But one of the things I'm really struck by is just some interactions that Jesus had, you know, with women. It's like the Samaritan woman, right? That's one that comes to mind now. The fact that he talked to her, and so it's this whole kind of background story. So I'm going to talk a little bit more explaining it, but the point is, in that time, right, Samaritans were different from Jewish people, right? I mean, I don't want to quite say black-white. I think they might have been from the same lineage. You know, somebody help me out here, but they didn't like each other very much, right? So you didn't just go up talking to a Samaritan. It'd be like, I know it's much more different. It'd be like a UNC Duke. I'm at Hawaii now. Hey, what's up, Dookie? How you doing, bro? You know, although I guess you are a Dookie, right? It'd be like that. It's like, wait, you're not expecting to see that sort of interaction between people. And then also, gender really mattered a lot in that context, right? Men just weren't supposed to be talking to women like that, unless you were married to them, or they were related to you. And so there's a whole sort of context there in that whole story. And I'm not going to pretend to break every aspect down to you all because I don't know all of it. But there's numerous interactions like that in the Gospels and how Jesus interacted with people, where he leveled the playing field. And there's another story where a woman is brought before a group of people. She committed adultery. And they want to stone her. They want to kill her because you can actually be punished by death for committing adultery. And Jesus says, okay, you who haven't committed sin, throw the first stone. Right? And I think he actually wrote something in the ground first. And I always want to know what he wrote. I don't know if anyone has ever known, and they will never know. And then one by one, people dropped their rocks and left because they couldn't, right? They weren't without sin. And so, again, though, it's like, wait a second, Jesus, you coming to the rescue of a woman who committed adultery? Like, man, we know under the law she's supposed to be gone. And so, just totally flipping the script, right? Changing the whole way that we interact and think about people and think about sort of roles and hierarchy. I mean, the Bible is ripe with that, in the Old Testament as well. So as I read the Bible and as I learn more from people who have gone to seminary and as I try to pray and ask God to help me understand some of what I read in scriptures, it becomes clearer and clearer to me, right? That people are equal, right? That we are meant for more, and that a lot of these sort of differences that are present in the world aren't really meant to be that way, right? We aren't just supposed to this sort of hierarchy and judgment. That's not how we're made to be. We're made to be more than that. And so that's a long way of saying, just through reading scripture and through learning more about it, it becomes clear to me that Christianity in particular calls for us to do more, treat people differently, right? And not hold on to these sort of biases and all that jazz.
So we wrap up real soon. One last question for our speakers here. One question about identity and then one question about truth. So I just invite you to talk a little bit about how you think of your faith alongside religions. So your faith identity, maybe alongside cultural identity, other things which they're part of your identity. Is this the most important part of your identity? Something you imagine giving up as part of your identity? Is it something that's really central to how you see yourself?
My faith is the most important part of my identity for me. My culture, my ethnicity, yeah, that's part of me too, but my faith determines who I am, what I do, how I live. It's every part of me. I don't, they're not on the same level.
So it's the most important part of your identity. And if you were to somehow change that, would you change those?
I would.
Great. And just real briefly as well, question about truth. So how do you think, you're welcome to talk about identity.
Okay, good. So I'm going to say, come on, I study race politics, Christian. That's what
we talked about this before.
Okay.
No, I'm just kidding. Go for it.
Oh, can I answer that? Just real quick. So I think, and I talked about this a bit earlier in terms of my whole life, breaking down these barriers, right, towards these different people groups. And part of that process, I should have said that earlier, so I'm glad you asked this question, is, along the way, as I've become more and more, it's my Christian identity has become like my sort of premier, primary identity, right? That's been like the process, right? That as I've been, and it's not that I'm somehow not black, I definitely am, I still see the world that way, but that's not the most important sort of identity for me, right? And I think that there are multiple identities in the politics, right? We try to account for how different identities are shape the way you engage in politics, right? African Americans, as compared to non-African Americans, people with who attend church a lot versus those who don't, right? A lot of what we study is based on identity, right? Gender identity and so forth. And so for me, my Christian identity is the most important, and that's been part of sort of my growth, right? It hasn't always been that way, and I definitely say that it is now, and I'm glad it is. I mean, I think it's made my life better. So,
good, that's great. So then, quick follow-up, not truth, and I'll ask both of you now. So sometimes when we talk that way, it can make it sound relativistic. This is part of what's central to me. This is what's my deepest meaning, where my deepest meaning is to be found, is in my faith. But that's just true for me. Christianity can be true for me, but for other people, it may not be true for them. And so it just becomes a matter of personal preference and personal taste. Do you think it's just that? Just the truth of Christianity? Do you think something more?
I think it's something more. I would say more than that. I almost want to pause and see how Christian would look at me. Come on, Chris, you're supposed to say more than that. I definitely think it's more. And so, no, I was going to mess with you, but I won't do that. So here's what I think, right? So, because I was in this position, all right? So it's been 10 years since I was in undergrad. I can't believe it, man. I'm getting old. I don't look as young as I used to. I've grown a few pounds since I had kids, but I used to look a little younger, right? But it's been 10 years, which is hard to believe. And I remember when I was in college, I really struggled with this question about the universal truth claim. It seemed so much easier. I met people, right, really good friends, people who were Hindu or some Muslim folks, I mean, people from all backgrounds. And at that point, it's like, man, I don't know how to make sense of it. They're great people, right? I like them, right? We eat good food. We like to go to dances, hang out, go watch basketball, whatever. How do I make sense of the fact that they don't believe in Jesus? I don't know how to get past that. And so what I said was, well, all right, just let them do them, right? This sort of relativistic response. Since I couldn't wrestle with the hard question of the universal truth claim. And since that point, though, and as I've grown in my faith, and I think really C.S. Lewis helped me a bit here. He's written a bunch of stuff, and the guy's great. Usually I have to reread his paragraphs 3 times because there's so much there. But I think in Mere Christianity, he makes this point. And it's really a smart point in terms of logic. Help me out, Christian. You're philosophers. Help me out here. The idea is, right, Jesus is either God, he's either who he says he is, or he's insane. Right? And I don't know if that would happen, but that's the way I remember thinking about that. There's no either one. There's no other option, right? Like the guy's either office rocker or he's God. Like, what other option is there? And how, right? And so I remember saying, wow, that really hit home. And so it's really hard when it comes to people with different faith traditions who really believe in them, right? And my job isn't to go and take this microphone, knock them upside the head, right? Knock some sense into them. That's not my goal, right? I believe, right, in the Holy Spirit. I believe that the people can be convicted and that God is pursuing people and making himself known to people. And I think Jesus, being God in flesh, is the clearest example of that, right? But I think beyond that even to this day, right, that God is pursuing people. And there are other books I can talk about, if you all want, that talk more about these things, people who read the Bible more closely and are more theologians. But I believe that to be true, right? And the only way, and I guess what helps me sleep at night is I'm hoping that, right, if that's true, which I think it is, that people are open and ask the truth to be revealed to them, that they'll come to know who Jesus is. And that's hard. And don't get me wrong, because I'm going to look at you and you say, Dr. Clark, I'm not a Christian, I'm this. And I'm not going to look at you any differently, right? I'm not going to pull out the Bible and say, you need to read this leaflet, right? I'm not going to yell on the street corner and tell you need to sign up for something. I'm not going to do that. That's not my place. I'm just going to pray and just hope that you get to know God enough. Anyway, I should stop while I'm ahead of myself. So that's the way I look at it. Charmaine.
Or Dr. Roy, I'm sorry. With some formal environment.
Yeah, I certainly agree with Chris. I mean, I have friends who are agnostics, who don't believe in any particular faith, and then there are those that think, they're all the same. That Jesus is not the one and only way to eternal life, and it's hard to maintain that perspective. But I've gotten to the point where I don't argue. I say it and I let them watch and see. And I share with them things that happen in my life. And God is so real to me. I mean, I see His hand at work every day in every aspect of my life. And that for me helps demonstrate to some of my friends, and I have had friends that have come to faith in Christ just based on what they have seen happen in my life and the lives of others. So you don't have to, as Chris said, beat people over the head. They will see. They will see the difference that God makes. And in many cases, it does not help to keep arguing and to try to get your point across and make people realize that, God is the only way. Just live the way He's called us to live and have people see His hand at work in your life.
Great, thank you. Let's thank our two speakers for being here. So I think we have plenty of time for Q&A. I've been told if you would like to ask a question to come down this aisle here, and there will be a microphone. In fact, no, I'm sorry, there will not be a microphone. But just speak really loudly so everyone can hear. So down this aisle. That would be great. Please.
Hi. So I know you mentioned this briefly, but I don't think you fully answered it. But what can we in this room as students at Wake Forest right now be doing to kind of be part of this reconciliation on a greater scale?
Thanks for asking that. That was to Dr. Roy, right? It's all good. No, that's a great question, and I've been thinking about that. So there are lots of different responses, right? So I'm gonna think about this sort of this academic and this to start out, then I'll kind of move beyond that sort of narrow world, right? So we know that people can kind of go through the representative democracy, right? So they're members of Congress, right? They're elected. There are people you can contact, your senator. There are people you can write and tell them, like, hey, like something's wrong, like laws need to be changed, right? We need the Attorney General to step in. Like you can say that sort of stuff and contact them, and they'll probably send you back some letter, some pro forma thing saying, thank you for contacting my office. I consider you concerned. Again, I'm not being cynical, I'm just saying that's how politics works. You get lots of sort of responses that way. And that is something, right? Because that's on their table, and it turns out that if enough people do that, it can get their attention and they'll actually move, right? Elected officials respond to those sort of things because they want to remain in office. Okay, another response. This sort of thinking of this sort of as a social movement side is protest, right? Is to picket, right? There are lots of different forms that can take. And I think both of these are actually reasonable responses. I think that you should pursue both of those. Right? Do both of those things. What I would say is, from my own experience, and again, from my own faith perspective, I can't condone like really violent acts, like shooting people or like beating up people, because I just don't think that's the right response, right? To inflict pain on someone else. And I can talk more about that later if you want me to, but I don't think that is the right response, given my own Christian identity, right, in terms of violence and beating them upside the head. I don't think that's the right way. But I do think it makes sense to sort of peaceful protest, I think, does go a long way. Now, in terms of this campus, so I've heard I've heard a little bit about what's going on. I don't want to pretend I'm an expert. But it seems to me like we all have a hard time dealing with this, like a lot of people, right? So let me just talk to you a bit about my own experience. I'm sitting on the couch and with my wife, we're listening to the indictment, or lack of indictment, I should say, being read. And man, I mean, I felt so helpless, right? It was completely disheartening. And I remember just thinking, like, there's nothing I can do. And this forum kind of makes me feel a little better, just being able to talk with you all and share some of my experience. But then it comes back to this, what do we do? And one of the things I was saying, I was talking to my wife about this last night, and I told her I might say this, I think I am going to say it, especially as a Christian, right, for other people who are, and even of other faith traditions too, right? Praying goes a long way. You might think, oh, Dr. Really, man, I came all the way here, I did get a sandwich, right, and this was sort of interesting for a while, and you're going to tell me I got to pray? Like, are you kidding me? What kind of response is that, right? That's kind of a cop-out. But it's not. It actually goes a really long way. And if you really do believe in God, believe in Jesus, and believe that, the prayer actually goes a really long way. And what I would say is pray for guidance and pray that you don't have your heart, that you don't become bitter, right? You don't swallow, I don't say swallow raw, but you don't want to become bitter and cynical and jaded. In fact, that'd be my prayer for you all, that doesn't happen, because it's easy to. You're like, man, nothing's ever going to change, right? Or as my pops would say, or James Brown, ain't nothing changed but the rent, right? Nothing has changed. But in fact, a lot has, right? A lot has changed. And so, prayer, let me just take a broader step back. So one of the things that's interesting, I haven't seen the movie Selma. I really want to see it. Hopefully you all had a chance to see it. I know, come on, Darius, I got 2 young kids, man. I'll get there in a second, right? I'll get there at some point. When it gets to the cheap movie theaters. But I want to see that movie. But one of the things that really struck me about the civil rights movement, okay, the little I know about it, is that, right, it was rooted in faith, right? Like, and we all know that. We don't talk about it as much these days, right? But it turns out that it was, right, it became out of a Christian perspective, right? Sort of nonviolent approach, which I think is really powerful. And it also turned out that change was really glacial, right? It was really slow. It took a really, really long time. But something did happen. So let me just put on my professional hat here for a second. So there's something called the Civil Rights Act of 1964, okay? Critical act, 1965 Voting Rights Act, which I'm not gonna get to the Supreme Court stuff because that's not this morning, but it still is intact in some way. And then without the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act of 65, what I study in terms of black representation, I couldn't study because there just would be no black elected officials, well, in the South at least, and there would be very few outside the South. I know I'm saying a lot here, folks. What I want to say is those civil rights movement made a difference. Okay? And I think those 2 pieces of legislation, it did more than that, but those 2 I can look to and say, look, that came out of the civil rights movement. And it took a really long time. A lot of people died, right? A lot of blood was shed, a lot of effort was put into it, but the difference was made, right? And I look at the way in which they did it, and I think that is the right way to do it. Shirley Chisholm has a quote in one of her books. Shirley Chisholm ran for president in 1972, West Indian descent actually, right? Incredible woman. Died a while ago. I wrote I know a little bit about it. I'm not going to do my research, but she made a point in one of her books that in terms of the Black Panther response, a sort of violent response, right? Because there are these different sort of movements among African Americans in terms of what's the best way to respond, right? It turns out, I think she said it this way, you know, the other side has more guns, I think is what she said. I was like, wow, Shirley Chisholm was brilliant, and that's like a really smart point. So in other words, you can get guns, you can try to like use that violent approach, but it turns out that the other side, military, the government, the other people have a lot more weapons, and it's going to be hard to win that way. So that's why I don't think, besides my faith as well, from a practical standpoint, it makes sense to use that as a way to actually make a difference. Because the other way made a difference. I know I'm talking a lot here, but this is a hard question. So I just read Tim Tyson's book. He's at Duke, okay? But don't hold against a brilliant guy. He has a book called Blood Doesn't Sign My Name. He wrote in 2004 when he was at Wisconsin, Madison. No one here got my Wisconsin joke. Somebody can thank you. Something get it. Wisconsin. All right. Beautiful, beautiful book. And one of the things he says a lot of things, is that what made the civil rights movement so effective was how it appealed to people's morality. Right? And I don't want to start to say more about it because Tyson has a lot more there, but he said there was something about that was important because people realized that they were better than what they currently were, right? And that's why it made a difference. Not because they used weapons and tried to beat up people, but because it appealed to people's morality. So anyway, I would say take a look at that and think more about that. So I don't know. So I wish I could give you a more concrete answer, but I definitely think praying goes a long way. I think asking for guidance about what the right response is. I really do think that there is something to right elected officials, right? You take part in sort of protest movements, but I think there really is a big difference in our own individual lives that you might not see now, but that down the road could really make a difference in terms of how you live your life and how you interact with people. Maybe it's what career you're going to. I don't know what your major is. I don't know if you all want to go, you know, business field, become lawyers, but there are ways in which you can fight for justice, right? Because I think that one of the biggest things in Ferguson that's a problem is the law was upheld. Right? And the reason why, and I think to myself, well, man, I know it's hard to change laws as I study this stuff, but it turns out that law can actually change. So maybe take part in trying to change that law so that a police officer can't get off without an indictment by participating in that, right? And it's a long road, right? It's a struggle, it takes a long time, but don't lose heart. In fact, that's what I would say. I think my mom even said that. I have to tell that lady when I talked about this, right? Don't lose heart, because if you do, I mean, I don't know. I think that's the biggest tragedy of all, right? It's a thing nothing can ever change. It becomes cynical, becoming bitter. Hold on to those aspirations, right? Recognize that change is glacial, but that it can occur. I'm going to say one other thing, and I'm really going to shut up here. I really like basketball, and I was reading this book. My wife got me for Christmas, like Sports Illustrated's greatest basketball. It's like this. It's not quite the Bible of basketball stuff. I'm saying a lot, it's kind of sacrilegious, but man, this is a beautiful book. And so Greg Popovich has a quote. They talk about him because he's a great coach. He's won a bunch of titles for the Spurs. Mr. Tim Duncan, Wake Forest grad. All right, see, I thought about that. And what he says is, it's this really great quote that he read. And it had to do with somebody that was hitting a rock, right? They hit a rock, And the 101st time, the rock cracked open, right? But the person knew that it wasn't the 101st law that led to the rock breaking, right? It was the previous 100 that went into that. All right.
I think you took away everything.
I'm sorry.
Because one of the things I was going to say is that your voices be heard, and there are all kinds of ways of doing that. I mean, you're students, so you know more about social media than everybody else does. And there are all kinds of social media outlets that you can tap into, and you can initiate to let your voices be heard individually and collectively. Because there are things that each of us can do on our own, and then there's power in numbers. And so joining with other groups or starting a group with others of the same mind, I think, are ways of becoming involved. The career thing, yes, and that is a little down the road. You ask what students can do now, but I certainly believe in entering careers where you see you can make a difference, whatever it is. I mean, for me, it's genetics and race, and the issue of race and how we think about race and how we apply it in society, in medicine, in science. That, for me, is something I want to change, the way that's done. And so taking on careers or going into careers, or it doesn't even have to be a career, but taking on something while you're in college that helps you to go on a path where you can make a difference, I think are all ways of getting involved.
Other questions, please?
So this is going back to an earlier topic that's kind of related to this. So if we talk about like the history of Christianity in this country, there is like a cultural aspect to it that takes things from our history of like being involved in slavery, that takes things that aren't necessarily from the faith. So I know especially I'm from the South, and so like in my due to the seven churches and spaces, it creates a barrier due to like the cultural ideas that my churches absorb that doesn't allow for a relatability into the races. So my question is about how do we start rooting out like these kind of cultural ideas that have made it into Christianity, that define what it means to be a Christian American, an American Christian, but does not actually reflect the faith. If that made any sense.
No,
That's a great
I
question.
understand.
Yeah.
How do you root those out? That was a main question.
Or how do we start to think about what we
Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna start off with I want to say more, but I have to say this. I always love to make this sort of reference. Y'all ever heard the term generational replacement? Okay. It's academics like to come up with different terms for things, but all that means is that people die, and so those ideas die with them. So I'm not trying to wish all these folks dead, right? But what I'm saying is, right? I have a point, but I had to start off with that. What I'm saying is, I think we have a lot of hope because the fact that you asked that very question, that you recognize that, right? I'm not saying this is all age, but my guess is if I were to look at some data, look at the distribution of attitudes and the questions you're saying here, that's more prevalent among older people. You might say, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but so what do we do before they die, right? Sort of what you're getting at. But because that's a really important question. So I think what I would say is, wow, I don't think you can. It's hard to change the hearts of people, right? Especially when they're older. But it is possible. And I know it's hard to like speak out against your elders, and I'm not trying to get you like in trouble with your family or kicked out or anything, right? But I think there is a way, and they have to do it in a gentle way too, to, I won't say correct, but make known that that you've experienced things differently. And I don't know if it's just since you come to college or not, but whether it's around the dinner table or family functions or wherever some of these ideas sort of come forth about what it means to be a true American or what it means to be a true Christian, if there's a way for you to gently, which is hard, but and with grace, express how you've experienced things differently. And you couldn't just be written off as, oh, she's off at college. And that's what happens when people go to college. They really come back home, after the fact and get rid of all those sort of crazy ideas about, that are being spouted in those institutions. But it actually can make a real difference. Let me offer one other thing. I normally wouldn't do this, but I think it might help me answer this question. Because I've actually seen people's sort of hearts change. So it turns out that, so I went to Iowa and I married my wife. I met her in Iowa, we got married. She's white. And again, just evidence of the fact that I married a white person. And given what I told you, I grew up in the hood in Kansas City. I was Mr. Black Man, right? Y'all ever seen Save the Last Dance? I know that's like an old movie, right? Julie Stiles and the brother, I forget the brother's name, but kind of stocky dude. I don't forget the brother's name, right? But I remember thinking, man, I'm not going to do that, right? I want to be the successful brother, and I'm going to marry a sister girl. Right? I'm not going to like leave my culture. Again, I'm not saying it's right. I've changed people, but that's the way I saw the world, right? But through this process of God breaking down these barriers and helping me realize who I truly am, right, in terms of being a Christian and that being most important. And my wife, she's a Christian as well. I was able to fall in love with her, and we're married. We have two beautiful young girls. And with her family, they weren't too keen, right, initially on me being a black guy, right, the brothers, I would say, right. But it turns out that that's changed significantly, and I can sit and hang out with them, and even though we have different views about a lot of different things that I won't go into detail for a lot of reasons, I still love them and they love me, and the fact that that relationship is the way it is evidence that change can happen. So I'm not saying you got to marry somebody from another culture. That would be something. Boy, I might get in trouble for that. But what I'm saying is that's just an example in my own life about how that can actually happen. And I think that when they see you have a friendship relationship or something with someone who's different, that's really important to you, the fact that they do love you, I think that can make a real difference in terms of how they see that person. It really does. And that's an extreme example, right? But it gives me hope that even older people, right, before they die, if they have generational replacement, can have their hearts changed. You might be the sort of catalyst in that. And it's a hard road, and it requires strength and sort of sticking to your guns and saying, hey, like, I'm going to, have the ideas I have, even if they disagree with yours. So I encourage you, and I wish you well in that regard, but it actually can make a difference. So hopefully that answers your question, Charmaine.
Just to follow up on that, it's certainly engaging them in discussion. Because sometimes you feel like there's this brick wall between you and the people who hold those views. And there are ways of engaging, just engaging in discussion. Not a debate, but just discussion about the issues. And I think it won't always change things, but I think your approach, as opposed to just being totally frustrated and just figuring that they're just so off base, figuring out ways of engaging in discussion, I think, is a first step. And sometimes that will soften the relationship and make them stop and think about how they have viewed it all this time, and probably begin to see some of the light in what we're trying to say.
Time for another question? Can you please stand up? You don't walk all the way around, just so everyone can hear you. Please.
Professor Clark, just as a political scientist, I'd be interested in, we had this idea of the role that kind of people moving into different neighborhoods and kind of the way districts are drawn, influencing voting, influencing kind of makeup of your state's representative officials. So what, taking back to faith and I guess the church being the social sphere, if you will, of Christianity, the larger church as a whole. What do these practices of, just like clumping of like people together around, how do you see they influence, church makeups and the number of churches we can consider racially diverse, and how do we break down those very entrenched barriers? Because it seems like that's a big reason that the church continues to be so segregated.
Yeah, so I think it's called sorting. I don't know, it's hard to keep track of all these terms. But I think what you just described there is this whole idea, right, that people who are like each other are starting to move to similar neighborhoods, and so sort of yuppie, gentrified areas, and then, rural, whatever, right? So you can like divide America really cleanly in those ways. That's a really good question. I didn't think about the link between those two. And so I think it is something to that. I think you're right. It makes sense to think that if we are doing that, right, and even if they draw lines that way or not, right, that sort of process is taking place, it does encourage people to only talk and interact with people like themselves, right? It encourages groupthink, and I think think it's another term called echo. Anyway, I'm not going to belabor you on all these points, but it makes it hard to then hear a contrary opinion. So then, right, of course, that particular news source is the right news source, right? Because we all watch the same news source. And it does make it difficult for you to then move beyond that. Although that said, what I will say is I wouldn't attribute it. I see what you're saying about district lines and sort of voting and all that, but I kind of think those things is a little bit separate, right? Because people choose where to draw lines, and in many ways those lines are invisible, and so even regardless of whether those districts are drawn that certain way, people live in neighborhoods, right? They're sorting. I don't think the sort of district part is as important. But I don't want to be nitpicking. I actually write a paper for you, right? So to get to your question, to break down those barriers, I think what you need is you need brave people, right? And relate back to the answer I tried to give earlier. And maybe you need a couple of friends, right? I don't know if you want to do this by yourself, but be adventurous and maybe choose to go to a church that you know isn't made up of people like yourselves. And I'm not saying necessarily go to the roughest neighborhood in Winston or whatever. I don't know what that's like. I don't know this area very well. I barely know Chapel Hill. That's where I live. But maybe go and check it out. And maybe people look at you like this sort of, it's just these college students doing here, blah, 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 blah. But then maybe you get to know these people, right? They get to know you. You develop a relationship with them. And all of a sudden, changes can be made. And you yourself could be a testimony, an example of, hey, a couple of friends and I go to this church, particularly, what in most cases people, students from Wake Forest wouldn't dare be associated with, and that will go a long way, right? And maybe nothing's supposed to be a social media outlet, maybe you don't become famous, but you can make a difference in their lives, and actually, you may know this already, it's probably more likely that they'll make a difference in your lives. You'll learn things from them in the process. So I don't know, maybe try that out. People who are courageous, but I think those small acts really do go a long way. You just have to be willing to be that outlier. Right? I mean, for me, it's easy. I'm a black person in America. I'm a minority. The story of my life has been, sort of being in white America. And I'm okay with that, right? I'm happy to be myself, okay? And in some ways, it's easier for me because I've had to do that, given the makeup of the U.S. And so it is harder coming from the other perspective, and sort of reaching out to people. But I think that's almost what's required, because in so many cases, we as a minority are forced to go to the other side. So that would be a really powerful testimony, actually, if you were to do that.
I think at this point we need to think about wrapping up, and Darius is going to be... Good? Okay. Well then, Darius is not going to be. So at this point then, let's just make our speakers one more time.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.